Flight 2317 to Atlanta gleamed under the afternoon sun at LaGuardia Airport. Inside the first-class cabin, Diana Thompson adjusted her Hermes scarf with manicured fingers, her designer carry-on tucked perfectly beneath the seat in front of her. At 52, she wore her success-like armor, a Chanel suit, Louboutin heels, and an air of superiority that came from 15 years as Manhattan's top real estate executive. The first-class cabin was her sanctuary, a carefully curated space where she felt everything was precisely as it should be. She scrolled through emails on her phone, barely acknowledging the other passengers boarding the plane. That was until a shadow fell across her lap. Staff Sergeant James Richardson stood in the aisle, double-checking his ticket. His pressed military uniform bore the weight of service medals, each one telling a story of sacrifice and courage. At 34, his posture reflected years of discipline, despite the fatigue around his eyes from a long deployment. "Excuse me, ma'am." His voice was polite, measured. "I believe I have seat 2B. Diana looked up, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together. Her gaze traveled from his face to his uniform, then back again. The corners of her mouth tightened. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice sharp enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. James checked his ticket again. "No mistake, Seat 2B. Diana's finger jabbed at the call button. The overhead lights dinged, and flight attendant Angela Martinez approached, her professional smile masking the concern in her eyes. At 29, Angela had handled her share of difficult passengers, but something in Diana's expression made her brace for what was coming. "Is there a problem?" Angela asked, her name tag catching the cabin light. Diana's voice carried deliberately through the cabin. "Yes, there seems to be a booking error. I specifically chose this seat for its position, and I don't feel comfortable with the current arrangement." Her eyes flicked dismissively toward James. "Surely there are more appropriate seats available?" The cabin fell silent. A businessman across the aisle slowly lowered his newspaper. 2 rows back, an elderly couple exchanged glances. James remained standing, his face a masterpiece of controlled dignity. Angela's smile didn't waver. "Ma'am, all our first-class seats are identical in terms of position and comfort. Staff Sergeant Richardson's ticket is properly issued for seat 2B. You don't understand." Diana's voice rose slightly. "I paid full price for this seat. I'm a platinum member. Surely some accommodations can be made for preferred customers who maintain certain standards." The word standards hung in the air like poison. James spoke quietly. "Ma'am, I also paid full price for my ticket. I'm returning from a deployment to attend an important meeting." Diana's laugh was sharp, dismissive. "A meeting? In Atlanta? I seriously doubt it's the kind of meeting that justifies first-class travel. This is obviously some kind of mistake or upgrade confusion." Angela's professional demeanor took on a steel edge. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to be clear. We cannot and will not reassign seats based on discriminatory requests. Staff Sergeant Richardson has every right to his assigned seat." "Discriminatory?" Diana's voice dripped with indignation. "I'm simply concerned about comfort and compatibility. Look at him. He's clearly not a regular in first class. I mean, what does he do when he's not wearing that uniform? Security? Maintenance?" Several passengers audibly gasped. A young woman in row 3 started recording discreetly with her phone. James remained standing, his silence more powerful than any response. "Mrs. Thompson," Angela's voice was firm. "This is your final warning. Such comments are unacceptable. If you continue, I'll need to involve the captain, and you may be asked to leave the aircraft." Diana's face flushed red. She gripped her armrests, knuckles white. "Fine. But I want this noted on my customer profile. The service on this airline has clearly deteriorated." James finally took his seat, movements precise and controlled. He didn't look at Diana, didn't acknowledge her exaggerated shifting away from him. He simply pulled out a leather portfolio filled with documents bearing corporate letterheads and complex financial charts, paperwork that would have told quite a story had Diana bothered to notice. The flight proceeded in icy silence. Diana repeatedly called Angela for trivial matters, each time making a show of her discomfort. James remained absorbed in his work, dignified in the face of her theatrical size, and mumbled comments about declining standards and political correctness gone mad. What Diana didn't notice was how other passengers watched her with increasing disgust. She missed the respect in their eyes when they looked at James, the admiration for his composure. She was too absorbed in her own prejudice to see how her behavior painted a portrait not of superiority, but of ugly ignorance. As the plane began its descent into Atlanta, Diana gathered her belongings with deliberate movements, making it clear she couldn't wait to escape her seatmate. James continued reviewing his documents, complex financial projections and acquisition proposals that would become significantly relevant to Diana's life in less than 24 hours. The aircraft touched down in Atlanta, and Diana practically leaped from her seat, barging past other passengers to be the first one off. James took his time, carefully storing his portfolio in his briefcase. Angela approached him as the cabin emptied. "I'm so sorry about that, Staff Sergeant Richardson," she said quietly. James smiled, a gentle expression that reached his eyes. "No need to apologize, Ms. Martinez. Some people can only see what they expect to see. Tomorrow might broaden her perspective considerably." With those cryptic words, he left the aircraft, carrying himself with the same dignity he'd maintained throughout the flight, while Diana Thompson hurried through the terminal, completely unaware that her actions today would soon return to haunt her in ways she couldn't imagine. The morning sun streamed through the towering glass windows of Richardson Technologies headquarters in downtown Atlanta. Diana Thompson stood in the marble lobby, adjusting her St. Laurent blazer, confidence restored after yesterday's unpleasant flight. The merger she'd orchestrated between her real estate firm and Richardson Technologies was worth $300 million, a deal that would certainly secure her position as managing partner. "Mrs. Thompson?" A polished receptionist approached. "Mr. Richardson is ready to see you." Diana followed her through a series of sleek corridors, her heels clicking against polished floors. The walls displayed a timeline of Richardson Technologies' growth, from a garage startup to a billion-dollar tech empire. She barely glanced at the photos, too focused on mentally rehearsing her presentation. The boardroom doors opened to reveal Richard Richardson, a distinguished black man in his early 60s, whose presence commanded immediate respect. Diana's professional smile froze as her eyes moved to the person standing beside him, Staff Sergeant James Richardson, now wearing an impeccably tailored suit, his military bearing unchanged. "Mrs. Thompson," Richard's deep voice carried a hint of amusement. "I believe you've already met my son, James." The blood drained from Diana's face. Her designer handbag slipped from nerveless fingers, scattering papers across the floor. James, the same man she'd so thoroughly demeaned yesterday, stepped forward to help gather them. "Please, allow me," he said, his politeness a devastating reminder of his dignity on the plane. Richard Richardson settled into his chair, watching the scene unfold. "James was just telling me about an interesting flight he had yesterday." "Quite a story." Diana's hands trembled as she took her seat. The boardroom suddenly felt airless. The presentation she'd prepared seemed to evaporate from her mind as she stared at the father-son duo before her. I had no idea," she stammered. "Clearly," Richard replied, his tone measured. "James here oversees our veteran outreach program, among other executive duties. After 3 tours of duty, he earned his MBA from Harvard. He's also our incoming CFO." Diana's gaze darted to the wall behind them, now noticing the family photos she'd overlooked. There was James in his graduation robes, James receiving military honors, James breaking ground on new Richardson Technologies facilities. The evidence of her catastrophic misjudgments surrounded her. "We take great pride in our company culture, Mrs. Thompson," Richard continued. "Diversity, respect, and dignity aren't just buzzwords here, they're the foundation of our success. When I started this company 30 years ago, I encountered many people who judged me by my appearance rather than my capabilities." James opened the leather portfolio he'd been reviewing on the plane, the same one Diana had pointedly ignored. "These projections suggest your company's approach to corporate culture might not align with ours." "I can explain," Diana began, but Richard raised his hand. "Actually, I believe your actions have already explained everything quite clearly." He leaned forward, his expression stern. You see, Mrs. Thompson, before any major deal, we make it a point to observe how potential partners treat people when they think no one's watching. Diana's mind raced back to the other passengers on the flight, the young woman recording with her phone. You planned this? Not exactly, James replied. My flight booking was genuine. Your reaction to it, however, was quite illuminating. Richard stood, straightening his jacket. This merger required more than just favorable numbers, Mrs. Thompson. It required compatible values. Yesterday, you demonstrated a profound lack of the principles we consider non-negotiable. Mr. Richardson, please, Diana's voice cracked. My behavior was inexcusable, but it doesn't reflect my company's values. Doesn't it? Richard picked up a tablet, showing her something that made her sink further into her chair. Your behavior inspired several viral social media posts. #FirstClassRacist is trending. Your company's stock has dropped 12 points since markets opened. James cleared his throat. The video has over 2 million views. Multiple news outlets are requesting comments. Diana's carefully constructed world was crumbling. She thought of her team waiting at their hotel, expecting news of their career-making deal. She thought of her board members, who had trusted her to secure this merger. We'll be pursuing other options for our expansion plans, Richard stated firmly. And Mrs. Thompson? I suggest you use this experience as an opportunity for growth. Real growth, not just financial. As if on cue, Diana's phone buzzed, her company's CEO demanding an immediate explanation for the viral video and the failed merger. The message was followed by another, informing her of her immediate suspension pending an investigation. James stood, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. You know, Mrs. Thompson, yesterday you asked what I do when I'm not in uniform. Now you know, I help build a company that believes character matters more than appearance. That integrity isn't just a word in a mission statement. Diana gathered her belongings, her movements mechanical. The magnitude of her failure, professional and moral, was overwhelming. As she reached the boardroom door, Richard spoke one last time. Mrs. Thompson, the next time you see a soldier in uniform, remember this moment. Remember that appearances don't determine worth, but actions reveal character. She nodded numbly and walked out, leaving behind not just a failed merger, but the shattered remains of her own prejudices. As the elevator descended, Diana Thompson, who had spent her career rising to the top, finally began to understand just how far she had fallen. Through the lobby's glass walls, Atlanta's skyline sparkled in the morning sun, indifferent to her humiliation. Somewhere in that skyline, her career was imploding, her reputation dissolving, all because she had chosen to judge a man by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. The irony of it happening in Martin Luther King Jr.'s hometown wasn't lost on her. 6 months could change everything. Diana Thompson sat in her home office, staring at the invitation on her desk, Richardson Technologies Presence, Corporate Leadership and Diversity Summit. Her name was listed as a guest speaker, a reality that still felt surreal. The aftermath of that disastrous day had been brutal. The viral video had amassed over 10 million views. Her company's board had suspended her for 3 months without pay. News outlets ran stories about corporate America's hidden racism. Former clients distanced themselves. Her carefully built reputation lay in ruins. But destruction sometimes paved the way for reconstruction. You have a choice, her therapist had told her during those dark weeks. You can let this define you, or you can let it transform you. Diana had chosen transformation. It began with a handwritten letter to James Richardson, not asking for professional redemption, but expressing genuine remorse. His response had surprised her. Change doesn't happen through cancellation, he'd written back. It happens through education and understanding. What followed was unexpected. James invited her to attend Richardson Technologies' Veteran Employment Program. Diana found herself sitting in rooms filled with soldiers transitioning to corporate life, men and women of every race, each carrying stories that humbled her. She met Lieutenant Amara Jackson, a black woman who'd commanded troops in Afghanistan and now led technology teams. She worked alongside former Sergeant David Rodriguez, whose combat experience had evolved into brilliant project management skills. Each interaction chipped away at her prejudices, replacing them with understanding. The day that truly changed everything came 3 months into her journey. James had asked her to help review resumes from veteran applicants. Among them was a folder that made her pause, a young black soldier whose qualifications eerily mirrored James's when he'd started. "His name is Thomas Wright," Diana said, holding the resume. "Harvard MBA, distinguished service record." James smiled. "Remind you of anyone? I would have dismissed this 6 months ago," she admitted, her voice thick with shame. "I would have seen his photo and made assumptions. I would have missed everything that matters." "But you're not that person anymore," James replied. "That's why I wanted you here today." The next week, Diana's company called. They'd been watching her work with the veteran program. The board was impressed with her transformation. They wanted her back, not in her old position, but as head of their newly created Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. Now, 6 months later, Diana stood at the podium of Richardson Technologies Summit. Hundreds of corporate leaders filled the audience. She saw James and Richard in the front row, their presence both supportive and reminiscent of how far she'd come. "My story begins with a first-class airplane seat," she started, her voice steady. "But it's really about a first-class lesson in humanity." The room fell silent as she recounted that day. Her prejudice, her humiliation, her fall. But then she spoke about resurrection. About how James and Richard Richardson had chosen education over annihilation. About how true leadership meant acknowledging your failures and learning from them. "Today, my company has hired 37 veterans through Richardson Technologies program," she announced. "But more importantly, we've changed how we see potential. We've learned that talent, intelligence, and leadership don't come in predetermined packages." After her speech, Richard Richardson approached the podium. "When we evaluate corporate partnerships now, we look for companies that demonstrate growth, not just in profits, but in perspective. Which is why I'm pleased to announce that next month, Richardson Technologies will be launching a joint venture with Thompson Real Estate's new veteran housing initiative." The audience erupted in applause. Diana's eyes filled with tears as she looked at James, who nodded in acknowledgement. This wasn't just business redemption, it was human transformation. Later, at the reception, a young black lieutenant approached her. "Ma'am, I've heard your story. It's brave to admit when you're wrong." Diana shook her head. "Brave is what you do, Lieutenant. What I did was simply become a better human being." As she drove home that evening, Diana passed a military convoy on the highway. 6 months ago, she would have barely noticed them. Now, she thought about the stories each of those soldiers carried, the potential they held, the respect they deserved. Her phone buzzed with a message from James. "Ready to start work on the joint venture tomorrow?" Diana smiled, remembering his words from that flight. Some people can only see what they expect to see. She had learned to see differently, and in doing so, had found not just redemption, but revolution in her own heart. The sun set over Atlanta as she drove, painting the sky in colors that looked the same to everyone, regardless of who they were or what they wore. Diana Thompson had learned that the most expensive thing in first class wasn't the ticket, it was the cost of prejudice. And she would never forget that lesson.